I'm excited. The next session is actually a great continuation for this conversation. I'm excited to welcome Shirish Kulkarni from the Bureau Local and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He's a journalist, researcher, and community organizer based in Wales. In his work at the Bureau Local in the UK, he's focused on building investigative journalism with and for people and communities. He's currently working on creating a pilot project aimed at creating inclusive, community-driven newsrooms to build power and spark change. And I think that this conversation that Shirish is about to lead is a great continuation of what Michael and Kate just sort of introduced us to. Is they talked about using crises as opportunities, and Shirish is going to talk about how are people feeling? How can we work with communities as we emerge from crisis moments? Shirish, take it away.
Lovely. Thank you, Ariel, and thank you to the Membership Puzzle Programme for inviting us to the summit today and for all the brilliant, innovative and important work you've done over the last few years. I'm a huge fan. So as Ariel said, my name's Shirish, and my confession for today is that I'm just entering the world of reading glasses. So I'm really in that, do I need them? Do I not need them kind of mode? So bear with me on that. So yeah, as Ariel said, I am a community organizer at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session, mainly because I get to work with Vanessa, Maria and Shazia, our great panel, but also because I think the intersection and merging of community organizing and journalism are enormously important for the future of our industry, because I think that work points the way to a different, more representative and more inclusive future. And I think in a world where trust is perhaps the biggest of many existential problems facing journalism, the work of community organisers should, I think, be a real inspiration to people who want to build journalism that is truly fit for the future. And I should say too that this panel came about as a result of a suggestion to the project. So essentially many newsrooms saw spikes in support at the beginning of the pandemic. And the question was, how can we maintain that level of engagement and interaction even when there isn't a big news event or crisis? Now we'll do a bit of unpacking of that in this session, but I'm delighted to start by introducing our panelists, Shazia Ali and Vanessa Maria Graeber. So like me, Shazia is a journalist and community organiser based here in South Wales in the UK. She works for an organisation called EAST, the Ethnic Minorities and Youth Support Team Wales, who run a huge and amazing range of projects to support people of colour, refugees and asylum seekers living in Wales. And right now, as Ariel said, Shazia and I are working together on a joint East Bureau Local project called Telling Our Own Stories, in which we're creating a new community newsroom. That's the pilot for a programme we hope to roll out across the UK next year. And that actually hasn't been announced yet, so you guys are the first to know. But I'm also delighted to welcome Vanessa Maria Graeber, the News Voices Director at FreePress, a national media and technology advocacy organisation. Vanessa is a movement journalist and organiser whose work has focused on media justice, community radio, and drug policy reform. And as Ariel said, I think this really picks up from a lot of the work we were just discussing with the team from The Intercept. She's worked on many issue-based campaigns that have employed her media and community organising skills. And in her role at FreePress, she organises journalists to be more engaged with their communities. Which I love. So the way we've approached this panel is through that lens of community organising, but I guess perhaps not everyone here will be familiar with that lens or that approach. And actually it means a whole range of different things to different people. So I want to begin by asking you both to start off with, what does community organising mean to you? And how would you say the approach of community organisers differs from that of journalists or newsrooms? So Shazia, maybe you'd like to go first.
Hi everyone, lovely to be with you today. Yeah, so for EAST, community organising and community support is what they do. I haven't been with them very long, so I'm going to try my best to represent them well. But it's meant being a part of the community and completely immersed in the communities they support. So having that support be continued, supporting refugees and asylum seekers as they arrive here, to settling them, to supporting people finding jobs, to putting on activities for the ethnic minority youth through the summer. So it's long continued support in so many aspects. Yeah. Can you just repeat the question, Shirish? What was the end of that question? Did you want to talk about how it?
I suppose it's how the approach of community organisers differs from the way journalists work. So in that context, I suppose what you're talking about being there continuously, showing up over time, is largely not something which news organisations do. Like, they'll turn up for the news story, but maybe not over time.
Yeah, that was kind of my experience. So I think this differs because with my work in broadcast news, so in a local station here, I was always encouraged to go in, go out, get the story and leave. And there was rarely a supportive relationship that's cultivated with the community and with people. And I feel like journalists tend to just jump into people's lives and use their story as a case study, but that's so largely in contrast to the work that we do with East, which is long continued support, a part of people's lives.
Yeah, and to me, that feels like building a relationship. And actually, that's how relationships work, that actually you're there over time, being predictable, being sincere, and being there for people. And actually, that's something that journalists feel uncomfortable with sometimes. Vanessa Maria, I wonder what your thoughts on that are, because I think there's also questions that, the question, I think in a way it's a red herring that's brought up, is also around objectivity in those situations as well.
Yes, indeed. So glad to be here with you. Forgive me, I have a little cold, so I don't have my normal lovely radio voice. But community organizing is really, I mean, if you boil it down into nuts and bolts, is engaging with the community, organizing them and empowering them to make some type of change that they want. That could mean solving a problem, impacting structural change, like passing legislation, or educating people so that they shift their culture. And so I don't know that most newsrooms operate with the idea that they're going to organize their audience or their public to do something to better society. Usually it's the inverse, right? Like, journalists are organizing themselves to make some type of change to their journalism. But I think we need to have this two-way relationship, right? Where we each have skills and roles to play and contribute. And when it comes to objectivity, I think we could have a whole conference debating the idea of objectivity. But I think when it comes to building trust and building relationships with the people that you're looking to serve, objectivity doesn't really exist, because you're dealing with human beings, right? Who have a set of values, a set of ethics in which you're all operating from. And I think that's what brings people together in community organizing, right? Like, what do we have in common? That's usually the first step when you have a town hall meeting or some type of organizing meeting. You ask the question, why are we all here? What do we want to do? And you start to brainstorm strategies for making that happen. Very rarely is a successful campaign completely dictated by an organization or a set of organizers, right? There has to be a community-driven strategy where you are listening to the community, engaging with them, building trust, building relationships. And that relationship, the information they give you is informing the strategy that you work on together. Again, I don't know that most newsrooms operate from that same framework. I've worked in commercial media where a lot of the strategy was determined by people in the business or financial department, right? They come up with the quotas about, clicks and followers and all of that sort of thing. And it seems a little disconnected from the on the ground work that you're doing. And so I think, again, when approaching people and when talking to people about the work that you do, whether you're a journalist or community organizer, it's finding that value system that you share in common. Do you care about your neighborhood? Do you care about safety? Do you want to stop corruption? Do you want to hold people in power accountable? Like, what's the thing that binds you together. And I agree with Shazia that a lot of my experiences working with media, both as a journalist and both as an organizer, has seemed really extractive. And so I don't think you can be objective and extractive at the same time, right? There's a profit to be made. And so that in itself means that you're not objective anymore. And so again, I think focusing on the community part is really essential. No matter what your campaign is, no matter what news you're trying to produce, and a community that can survive multiple crises, right? Like, again, if you don't have that strong core community, things can easily fall apart as soon as the crisis passes.
Sure. And I think the thing I'm picking up from what both of you are saying is there's something about long-termism rather than short-termism, that actually community organizing has a long game in mind, whereas journalism and relationships and all those things which follow, whereas journalism is too often short-termist. What can I do to get this story out? And I think that leads into, because I think we do need to slightly unpick the spikes in support that media outlets saw at the beginning of the pandemic, and perhaps in a way that entwines with community organizing approaches. So I looked at some Reuters Institute report work, which found that in the UK, for example, where we are, where Shazia and I are, news use declined after an initial surge, and trust in news fell too. And news organizations were less keen to talk about that. They were very keen to talk about the big spikes. And a large minority of the public here, so 20 million people, so that's about a third of the population, did not feel that the news media or the government had explained what they could do in response to the pandemic. So the question I have actually is, what do we think in those spikes people were looking for from news media in that first wave of interest? And then I guess what follows there is, how do we think the news media then let them down? It seems to me there were fundamental human needs at play, which I think have gone unmet. If we swap it around, say, Vanessa Maria, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I suspect that will depend on where you live and what community you're serving. Certainly, we've seen the ebbs and flows of the pandemic happen, by which country you live in, right? One of the things we learned at FreePress when we implemented some info needs data gathering in New Jersey was that the people that we surveyed through text messages in 3 urban areas across the state were really interested in getting more information about how to access financial and economic resources. They had a lot of questions about the pandemic itself, COVID-19 testing and vaccines. And they had a lot of questions about virtual learning and employment. We used that data and held meetings with community members and newsrooms to connect the dots to understand why were people saying that those were information needs, like what was happening in those cities, so that people could kind of give more context for why people were making those asks. And then also brainstorming ways we could get that information outside of newsrooms, because the reality is a lot of newsrooms didn't listen to us because they had their own ideas or their own plan for the content they wanted to deliver. And also, a lot of newsrooms still have payrolls, right? Like these media outlets require subscription or membership, et cetera. So it wasn't accessible, and it probably wasn't going to be accessible. So having the community also problem solve, okay, well, assuming there isn't media, what can we do to get this information to people? What other resources, institutions, and technology can we leverage? And a lot of people wanted information delivered differently, something we hadn't thought about it. They liked having information sent to them through text message or on social media, mainly because many people lacked computers and high-speed internet in their homes. So I think, again, that's why problem solving with the community gives you really interesting background and insight into why these information flow problems exist, but also gives you solutions you might not come up with on your own in a newsroom. I think there were a lot of excellent examples of how newsrooms serve their communities by delivering this information, but at some point they reverted back to the traditional old programming. We used to see daily reports from the governor and from mayors about COVID numbers. They made a lot of content free and accessible if it was pandemic related. And some of those things stopped, right, when the numbers went down and when people felt like things were starting to get better. And so again, the innovations that they came up with, the things that were helping, were very temporary. So again, going back to this long-term thought process and strategy around information needs is not something we saw by and large by many commercial news media outlets. Local, independent, hyperlocal community media definitely had a different approach as to how can we make these suggestions, these innovations, more of a permanent strategy for the way we deliver and engage news. And then the other thing that we saw is that people wanted a lot of information from news consumers in the beginning, but they didn't continue to go back to them to evaluate how well they did, right? And if that they were still getting the information that they need. And then I'll say, finally, two things. One is that people told us repeatedly they were tired of hearing of the devastation and the deaths, and that it was just really stressing them out and making them feel more isolated and afraid. So again, balancing that type of content with the strides we're making, the solutions, the things that are positive that are happening as a result of the pandemic. And that also, I don't think that many mainstream media did a good job of combating disinformation, right? And showing that they are a verifiable source, that they're trying to give people accurate information, and again, building that trust with community members.
Sure, and what I pick up from all of that is it's new journalism is a weird industry in which we don't really adapt to user needs very well. I always say if we worked at Procter & Gamble or Unilever and didn't listen to what people wanted, didn't provide the things they needed, then we wouldn't be working at Procter & Gamble or Unilever very long. But actually journalism is like, yeah, we'll just do the same thing we've been doing. Why aren't people reading it? And that's not kind of how this stuff works. I'm not necessarily some massive fan of capitalism, but yeah, it's working with user needs. Shazia, what are your thoughts on that? And those human needs that journalism perhaps is missing, which community organisers are more used to picking up on?
I think the human needs you mentioned are people were just looking for connection, and people were looking for community, and like you say, what we provide at East. People were looking to have their views and thoughts and worries reflected. But instead, in the UK, in the national news, we got a lot of alarmist headlines just for the sake of being alarmist. And Vanessa's mentioned constant coverage of the deaths and the spikes. And I think people weren't looking for that. People were looking for information they could understand easily and access all of their needs that needed to be met. So things like children in rural areas couldn't access laptops and Wi-Fi, and there were government grants for it all, but there wasn't the information there on how people can access it. And that's what East were doing over the pandemic, getting all the information out to who needs it. Vaccine vans were driving around Wales and packing up at communities and mosques, and people weren't accessing that information from our news and our regional media. And it was organizations, again, like East, that were out in the community and getting that information there to them, but also providing, like you say, all the fundamental human needs. So that connection, that support, and that support was massively lacking in national news. Again, it's a little bit different in the UK because our national media is covering Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and all of our COVID rules were completely different. Our NHS, our health service works different in Wales and England. And so the information was completely different for all of these different places. People didn't know what was happening. And it was huge here for Wales because we looked at our Prime Minister in Westminster telling us the information, the restrictions, what was happening with COVID, and it was completely different in Wales. And I think everyone felt there was a huge, lack of meeting audience needs. And the basic need of understanding the information just wasn't there.
It's really interesting because I think it's a question that I come up against a lot of times, because I've worked in those big legacy mainstream TV newsrooms actually in London. And I think journalists are often, well, there's a misunderstanding about what the kind of line between news and information. And I think journalists are often quite sniffy about providing information. It's about providing the scoop or those big numbers. But actually, they think, well, actually providing information isn't our job. But I think what we're saying is that actually providing information that helps people understand their place in the world, how they can make their lives better, or how they can get the services they need, perhaps is a really, really big part of what people are missing from journalism. So I think that's really coming through very clear, that kind of line between news and information and kind of moving. So yeah, just to kind of pick up on what Ariel's dropped in the chat as well, before we start going into some questions from the audience, a reminder that you can drop those in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen right now. I want to ask you both really quickly what your top tip or your key strategy is for keeping engagement going with your communities when there's not a big event or not a big crisis. So Shazia, I'll come to you first on that.
Well, I think the East team would respond to that question with, what do you define as a crisis? Because for families who've arrived in the UK, refugee and asylum status, they need support in finding a house, furniture, school uniforms, and they would consider that a crisis. Their needs need to be met right now, instantly. For domestic abuse situations, that's a continued crisis. For people suffering with mental health, that's always a crisis to certain families. So East are there constantly. They're round the clock support. And a lot of the team, they have their phones on way past 5 p.m. If their clients need them, which they often do, they're there at all times. So in that sense, they don't really see crisis times in the pandemic. They kind of approach their work as a constant stream of support. And they do that by constant communication. So they're in WhatsApp groups with their clients, they're on Zoom calls, they do face-to-face client work. So I think when you pose that question, I think for East, they don't really differentiate. They don't really see it as the pandemic and that sort of support. And they're just a part of their clients' lives and the community's lives.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So that approach is actually, if we were to transpose that onto journalism, it's actually being in the community, being embedded in the community, hearing those stories all the time. And actually, stories aren't just happening when there's a crisis. Stories are happening which perhaps are being missed by journalists because they're not a big event. But actually, and I think what journalism is often bad at is dealing with systemic problems which happen over time. What they want is something which is a one-day event. And actually, we're missing a lot of those systemic questions because of not being embedded in communities. So I think that probably feeds directly in some of the stuff Vanessa Maria is going to talk about.
There's so many things. I mean, we have such a short amount of time, but I will say, first and foremost, you have to take care of your staff and like your house, right? Like you can't work and solve the neighborhood's problems if your own house is in disarray. So I think preventing journalists and employee burnout is really big, right? Because I think what we learned from a lot of journalists across the US is that they were really burnt out and traumatized because of all of the racist news coverage and the internal racism that they had experienced in trying to cover these stories, especially with all of the rioting and protesting in the United States around police violence. So, making sure that your people are good and they have resources accessible to them to be able to do the work. I think secondly, showing up when there's not just a story. So again, what other skills or resources can you leverage as a journalist and also as a news organization besides just doing stories? Are there events you can be hosting? Are there conversations you can facilitate? Are there ways your organization can utilize its space for the public? How are you being a hub for the community? I think that's what I learned when I was organizing for community radio. I visited stations all across the US, and I just saw how the spaces themselves were inviting to the community. And lastly, I'll say that it's really important to communicate wins, because as activists, that's what sustains us, that's what excites us about the work. People need to know that we are chipping away, right? We're the small axe on the big tree. Like, we are making progress. We are working towards that collective vision that we share. And so you need to continue to let people know what it is that you're doing that's serving the community, how we're winning together. And again, developing those relationships, being in the community, and not only showing up when there's a story is a process that happens over time. So I would encourage people, again, to think long-term, like, how can we build this community in the next 5 years? And how can we share that progress of our success with our people so that they're excited and engaged as much as we are?
Yeah, those are fantastic points. Thank you, Vanessa Maria. Because I'm really struck by, I get it a lot. It's like, yeah, we want to engage with people of color. We want to engage with the LGBTQI community, and we want to do it tomorrow. And that's not how that works. That's not how relationships work. And I think that point about communicating wins, something we do at Bureau Local actually, is we never consider the day the story comes out as the end of the story. That's sort of maybe 2/3 of the way through, that actually communicating the impact, how it's making change, is at least 1/3 of that process of an investigation. So because it builds that, oh yeah, we're actually achieving something together in this, which I think is really important. So thank you for that. So we have a question from Jacques Palmer. I hope I've got that right. So the question is, what are some of the community, so just I guess examples of some of the community organizations you partner with to get the word out to your audience? And what does your outreach strategy look like? So I think I'll come to Vanessa Maria on that, because actually Shazia works for a community organization. So maybe this is one for Vanessa Maria. And then if anyone has any other questions in the interim, do drop those in. So yeah, what are some of the community organizations you partner with, and what does that strategy of outreach look like?
Yeah, all kinds, you name it. I think that's part of like what our general strategy is at FreePress through our News Voices program, is to make the call out. Who cares about news and information? Who cares about social issues? And all sorts of people show up. We see a lot of artists and creative people show up. And I think that's a big part of this conversation, is how community organizers use cultural strategy to reach people, because everything can't be like serious and scary all the time. We need comedy, we need art, we need things that inspire. And I think the most beautiful and most shared protests are ones that are colorful and have lots of art in them. So I would say look for creative people that can share the message differently. The faith-based community has been really instrumental, especially in talking about COVID-19 and being able to reach people. Libraries are really important allies because they're another public space and hub for the community. We work with community colleges, universities, and all kinds of community-based organizations. It's especially useful if there's a population that you want to serve and you don't know where to begin. So when I was a station manager of a community radio station, I thought all the Latinos would show up in Philadelphia. That didn't happen. Just because I'm Latina doesn't mean that that was happening. So I looked for Latinx organizations in Philly that had programs, that had stories, that had news that they wanted to share, to see that how we can partner and create programming. One of the most successful partnerships that we had was working with an organization called Resolve Philly, and it was about 17 news organizations coming together to cover one issue, which was poverty. So that's another thing, like it can be overwhelming as a small newsroom to tackle these issues when you don't have the resources. But if you're in a collaborative like that, where you can all work together to cover something, I think that can be really useful as well. And then lastly, during the pandemic, we saw increased partnership and reliance on working with communications people from city, state, and federal government. So those are also really good relationships to develop, because they also have a shared interest in getting really important information, especially about resources, to the public. So one of the things I advocated for was Spanish language information in the form of press releases and interpreters to be able to increase access to our community. And they were more than willing to do that. And we did that by coming together with several different Latinx organizations to advocate for that. So these partnerships go beyond just like introducing people, but also how can we work together to make things more accessible?
Sure, thank you. And I think there's a really important point. I mean, it's kind of almost the first rule of community organizing is don't try and create networks yourself from scratch. These networks that want to tell their stories already exist. It's finding them, but also being trustworthy to them as well, which is not always a kind of journalist approach. And that reads nicely into a question, which I think is kind of, yeah, I can put to Shazia from Kate on trust. I mean, I suppose this is speaking from an East perspective. How do the people you engage with through East, how do they communicate with you rather than you communicating to them what they need in order for them to trust you? And I have some thoughts on this as well.
I think a lot of the communication we have with the clients in the community that the East team work with is that it always feels like two-way. It always feels like a conversation where we're sort of on the same side, because whether we're people of color or whether some of our team are past refugees and asylum seekers who achieve status, there's always this kind of shared values or shared experiences. So it always does feel like a collaborative conversation, and we're always hearing their needs and their wants. And I think they just feel comfortable and trust us in that sense, that they feel like they're speaking to people within the community. So it doesn't really feel two-sided in a sense. It does feel like a circular kind of community organization in a sense in that way. I think the community and the clients that work with East feel very much a part of the organization. So whether that's them volunteering on the activities that are going on this month. So for the school holidays, they've got lots of activities for the ethnic minority youth. So lots of people are volunteering for that, and they're taking part in staff roles. I think it's those sorts of things that really foster this environment in Swansea, where I am, where the community is sort of, they take on East's work as if it were their own in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that really kind of feeds into the thing which I always think about this, is I've had a couple of conversations recently with people running kind of community independent newsrooms. Well, I said, yeah, how do we get people to care about our publication? How do we get people to care about our outlet? And actually, we can flip that, because actually I said, what about if we show them we care about them? How about if we start from that perspective? And actually that's in such kind of a rare commodity that actually you create that two-way street where it's not really an us and them. It's kind of everyone caring about each other, which sounds kind of ludicrously idealistic sometimes, but actually it is the way relationships work. And I think that's what we've kept coming back to. It's how do relationships work? Let's build this stuff in the way we build our day-to-day relationships. So I think it's really good in a way to end on a positive message of care. So I really want to start by thanking our panelists, Shazia and Vanessa Maria, for your company, your insight, your expertise, and all the valuable food for thought you've given us. It's been a real privilege to spend time with you. I've learned a lot, and I know everyone here will be really grateful for that. And on that, I'd also like to thank everyone here for joining us, helping make the conversations so rich and collaborative and interesting. So take care. Thank you very much. And back to you, Ariel.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirish, for leading such a great conversation. I'm so glad that we were able to put this on the agenda, because as Shirish mentioned, the sort of initial idea around this session actually came out of a suggestion from a participant to the summit. And they brought it up in the context of everybody's talking about what happens to our the members, the surge of support, the surge of readership that we had because of the coronavirus pandemic. How can we maintain that audience? How can we maintain that support past the crisis? And so we took a little liberty here at MPP with that suggestion. I think they were really thinking about an audience question, the audience funnel, but as you all have said so eloquently today, it really is at its core about building the relationship beyond the crisis moment and showing up for them between the crisis moments. And I think you've done a fantastic job of I think, pointing out that the work that has to be done in order for us to maintain these relationships past this moment. So thank you all for joining us.